Welcome everyone! Once again, you really liked my latest Bobby Fischer video. I'm very glad to see that, and I'm also very happy to feature many more of his games. Today's game is quite unique in a way, and I'll tell you why in a minute. First of all, this was played in Buenos Aires in 1970, and he played Vladimir Tukmakov. Fischer had white. Now, why is this game unique? Well, do you remember Fischer saying E4 best by test? Well, b3 was Fischer's opening move. He did dabble with this move on occasion, and probably he was inspired by Larsen, who in fact used this opening as a main weapon. It can lead to all kinds of positions, including a reverse Sicilian position, as you'll see today. Tukmakov answered with e5, bishop b2 threatens the pawn, so knight to c6, and now c4. So this invites a reverse Sicilian position. Of course, in a normal Sicilian, black would trade his c-pawn for white's d-pawn. Now it's the other way around, so white's playing the Sicilian with an extra tempo. On the other hand, it's normal to play b7, b5 in many Sicilian positions, meaning b2, b4 for white. And white already spent a tempo on b2, b3, so if white goes b3, b4 later, he really doesn't have that extra tempo. Anyway, it continued knight to f6. Black's not going for d5 right away. e3, allowing the bishop to develop. It's not really attractive to develop the bishop on g2, because then black will go d5, and after pawn takes, queen takes, it's a bit awkward. White is not losing or anything after knight to f3, but it's certainly not white's best play. So e3, bishop e7, still not going for d5. a3, very logical move. White wants to go b3, b4 at some moment, and also he can now play queen to c2 without allowing knight to b4. Black castled, d3, sometimes white goes knight from b to d2, and here finally Tukmakov did strike out in the center, and after cd5 he recaptured with the queen, because he's planning to put pressure on the weakened d-pawn. Fischer now decided to develop the knight to c3, queen to d6, knight to f3, and now bishop to f5. Again, black's putting pressure on d3. Black would like white to go e3, e4, which would weaken the d4 square, but Fischer wasn't born yesterday. He went queen to c2, planning rook to d1 to lend support to the d-pawn. Ideally, white would like to use this rook on the c-file and the other rook on d1, but he's got to deal with the position at hand. Now rook from f to d8, rook to d1, and h6. Now the bishop can retreat to h7 if necessary, but it also means that white cannot maneuver his knight from g5 to e4. h3, queen to e6. Maybe h3 will be a target at some point, but it also allows doubling rooks on the d-file. Knight to d2, just making sure black doesn't have e5, e4. Knight to d7, good move. After knight to c5, there's even more pressure on d3. Second, it prepares a bishop retreat and then f5. Or maybe black wants to bring the queen to g6, which would be opposite white's king after white's castled. By the way, black shouldn't be tempted by this typical Sicilian sacrifice, knight to d4. Of course, the queen is attacked and taking would open up the king. However, white can just do that, and after e takes d4 check, the knight covers the king and white isn't in danger. Going back, Tukmakov plays knight to d7, bishop to e2 preparing to castle. Black shuffled the king in the corner. He could also play more aggressively with queen to g6, but thanks to h3, white can go for g4, and after bishop to e6, knight from d to e4, black is completely fine here, but it isn't the counterplay he was hoping for. Anyway, king to h8 was played. Fischer castled. Bishop to g6. After castles, it's of course tempting, but also very typical to start an attack with f7, f5. It is a bit slow though, but maybe this is the best attacking option at least that black has. Black can also try queen to g6, threatening the h-pawn and keeping an eye on d3. If then king to h1, then knight to c5 is the expected follow-up, targeting d3 twice more, but this doesn't work out. Knight from c to e4 first, blocking out the bishop. and after black trades, I really like recapturing with the pawn here, because the pawn defends important squares, including f5, so it interferes with black's f5 plan, and after bishop to e6, white can go b4, grabbing space, and maybe white can even go f2, f4 later on. Black instead went for the plan with f5, but Fischer has a plan of his own, b4, and then transferring his knights in order to occupy the c5 square. Now what happens after f5? If f5 here, first bishop to f3, and if now bishop to f7 to stop any plans with knight to b3 to a4 to c5, then white has b5, and after knight to a5, the knight is covered by the bishop on d5, and c7 is under attack. All is not lost yet, but it does look really dodgy right now. Instead of f5, a6 was played, so the knight can go from a7 to b5 if allowed. Now Fischer improved his rook. As mentioned before, c1 is the best square for the a rook. Now there is increasing pressure on the c file. Therefore, rook from a to c8 to guard c7. Rook from f to d1 improves the second rook. Now Tukmakov finally started his kingside activity with f5. However, after knight to a4, Fischer's plan did come in first, so he's planning to bring the knight to c5, supported by the other knight on b3, and he also plans bishop to f3, which combined with the queen and rook puts massive pressure on the knight on c6. Black is definitely in some trouble now. Maybe it would be best to interfere with white's plan to control c5 with bishop to f7. Now white doesn't have knight to b3 anymore, but white can still go bishop to f3, pressuring c6, but knight to b6 could give decent counterplay, because if white takes on c6 and brings the knight in, then black could trade that off, and after queen takes, go bishop to h5 attacking the rook, and after the rook dodges that, rook takes d3, also attacking the knight, and things aren't so clear. However, white isn't forced to take on c6 here. Knight to c5 is very attractive too. Black cannot allow that knight to stay, so bishop takes, white recaptures with the pawn, then knight to d5, and certainly this is preferable to what happened in the game, but black's still worse and he doesn't have real counterplay either. In the game though, Tukmakov put the knight on the rim, intending knight to b5, but this gives Fischer a very strong initiative. First of all, knight to b3, which was the intention, taking more control over c5. So b6 makes sense, but watch what happens next. Fischer played d4, and all of a sudden white is much more active. The dark squared bishop and the d-pawn pressure black's center. The light squared bishop suddenly has a target on a6, and also the knight on b3, which was really intended to cover c5, now also controls d4. This is actually quite typical for these hedgehog positions. For a long time the pieces and pawns are mostly on the first three ranks, then suddenly there is one pawn break and the pieces get all kinds of potential. Black is in desperate trouble now. If black tries to block out the light square bishop, then he'll eventually still lose a pawn. First, bishop to c4, after queen to c6, a trade on e5, then a rook trade, and you'd think that after bishop takes e5, knight takes a3 wins the material back, but then there's this tactic, bishop takes pawn check, and after king takes, queen b2 check forks king and knight, queen takes knight. Now black wins the piece back with b5, but that b-pawn will be lost either way. After knight to d4, b takes c4, the rook takes back, and black is a pawn down, and the pawn structure is also terrible. Tukmakov instead tries to counterattack as best he can. Now the white queen is under attack, but simply e4 closes that diagonal. Black here played knight to b5, maybe his best chance was taking on e4. After queen takes e4, white's knight is undefended, so queen takes. But white can still grab some extra material after bishop takes a6, queen takes a4 and bishop takes c8, and after the rook recaptures, white takes on e5, That should also be clearly winning for white, but at least this isn't as easy for Fischer. After knight to b5, the black position fell apart quite rapidly. First, bishop to g4, attacking the only defenders of the e5 pawn. The queen escaped, but after pawn takes, the rook will also get involved. The knight did take on e5, even though that loses the exchange, but black has nothing better. The rook recaptured, but after rook to d5, Tukmakov had seen enough and resigned. Why did he resign? The knight is attacked and pinned to the queen. If bishop to d6 defending the knight, a number of moves are good enough, for example knight takes b6 exploiting the pin, and if rook to d8, knight to c4 adds yet another attacker to the knight and it's really all over. Really convincing win by Bobby Fischer. I think these hedgehog positions really fit his strategic playing style quite well, and even more so when it's a reverse Sicilian position, as was the case here. I'm not sure how often he's played b3 in total, but I've seen 4 games of his and he won all 4 of them. Maybe I'll take a look at those at a later time as well. In the meantime, you can check out the playlist for many more great games. If you enjoyed, you could do me a big favor by liking the video and subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. See you guys again soon, and take care.